But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss how leaders and their decisions shape the world we live in today. Welcome to episode number 1 of the History in Motion podcast. My name is Ritchie, and I'm joined by our co-host Paul, and today we're going to be talking about Sir John A MacDonald and the Pacific Scandal, the first major political scandal in post-confederation Canada that put Sir John A and his nation-making project at the epicenter of our discussion, so we can better understand the scandal and ultimately his decision to take a bribe. What does this teach us about Canadian history? How can we better understand its decision-making and the impact it had, if any, on its legacy and the legacy of Canada? So without further ado, let's get into it.
Yes, I can.
Awesome.
All right, let's get started here. So we got Sir John A MacDonald. He's born in 1815 in Scotland. And so this was kind of an interesting time for the world. The Napoleonic Wars were still going on. Waterloo was about 9 months away. The War of 1812 was in its final months, where the United States invaded British-owned Canada. So he's born into this world where borders are consistently changing. You know, major countries are really fragile at this point, and these giant empires are still changing. Whereas, when you really think about it, that's 200 years ago, where you have these massive nation states, you know, having these really bloody wars, and you know, no state or no nation really seems like it's stable. And so that's kind of the world that he's. At the age of 5, he moves to Kingston with his family. So his father had started a business in Scotland, which failed. So like many people in that time looking for other opportunities, they came to what was still kind of be called the New World at the time. So they moved to Kingston, which is in Ontario today. And his father tried to start a couple more businesses, and unfortunately both of them failed. So you can kind of speculate with his father that he had this like entrepreneurial mindset where like he could have just worked in a coal mine or something, but kind of didn't really want to settle for that. He kept working and trying to do his own thing. And so we can speculate that, you know, Sir John A kind of saw that as he was growing up, and seeing that his father had that drive, but maybe for whatever reason, with luck or just not the right type of business, he just really wasn't able to get things going. But his father was able to become a magistrate of a local district in Kingston, where they kind of dealt with like low-level civil trials and kind of did pre-screens for criminal trials. So he kind of was able to see his father work in this, in the kind of the law and civil area of Canadian judicial system at the time. So then he went to school till about age 15, and that was typically when publicly funded education ended at that time. And his parents couldn't afford education past that. But there was kind of always these reports that, you know, he was just the kid who was buried in his books, always studying, loved to learn. And he kind of saw what his father was doing, and he said, hey, like, you know, why don't you become a lawyer? And at the time, too, money was tight in the family, and being a lawyer was something, you know, that would pay well. So he's kind of at this point where he leaves Kingston for York, which is modern day Toronto, in Upper Canada, so modern day Ontario. And at the time, no law schools existed in Canada, so he had to write the Upper Canada Law exam, which he passed. And he started working as an apprentice until he was the age of 19, which is kind of, you know, really young when you start to look at today, when you kind of go through your undergraduate degree, then you got to go to law school, and then you may get a job where you're kind of just doing shuffling papers around, and you don't really get to be that big time lawyer. But at the age of 19, the firm he was working at had an associate in Montreal, and that associate got pretty sick. And so his boss was like, hey, do you think you can take over this law firm? And so at the age of 19, he goes all the way up to Montreal, and he crushes it. He does really well. This associate really wasn't able to come back. So he ran this for 2 years. And really, you weren't even really legally allowed to be a full practicing lawyer until the age of 21, but it was kind of like this gray area where you were still kind of able to do it, which is kind of crazy for someone, you know, so young and just, you know, didn't have this formal education, didn't have all this money to come from. There was just clearly something innate with this guy that he kind of knew what he was doing. He was able to learn really quickly. And then by the age of 21, he becomes a fully licensed lawyer, and he's in York, and he's just doing high profile cases. So one of the most famous ones is it was a notorious child rapist named William Brass who was up for trial. And what does Sir John do? He puts his hand up and says, I'll defend him. And he lost the trial, but he was just praised for like the quality of his defense, which is kind of crazy, right? Like one of the worst crimes you can possibly commit. Like, how are you possibly going to have some sort of defense for that? But people were really impressed by how he was able to take what evidence that he had and put a really fair trial for this guy. And fortunately, he lost the case, but you still did that work, and people still noticed that. And then kind of as time goes on, like there's a rebellion in Upper Canada. There's a bunch of people who are in Kingston that rebelled against the government. And Sir John A says, "Hey, this is another high-profile case. Let me jump in and see what I can do here." And he's able to get all 8 of them off. And so now he's starting to take on these high-profile cases. He's being seen in the community. He's really starting to build that notoriety. And like, as someone who's popular and really smart, definitely kind of, if we look at someone like that today, like politics is always a maybe a logical next step. But for him at the time, like it wasn't so clear cut just because, Canada's not a country yet. It's still, this British colony. And it's not like there's a clear step to kind of get into government. So, but he continues to take on these high profile cases. He starts a real estate business on the side, ends up becoming director of a bank. So he's very wealthy. He's clearly highly intelligent. And the crazy part of all this is he's only 26 by this point. So he's done all these high profile cases. He's a fully licensed lawyer. He's a director of a bank, real estate business on the side. And so now he clearly has this drive, and he clearly has this high level of intelligence. And I think something that's interesting, Richie, here is we look at Canada at the time, and it was a place that, didn't really have an immense amount of wealth. Like if you were a high profile lawyer at the time, trained in a school in London, you're not moving to Canada to make a lot of money, right? You're staying in
Backwater
London.
Canada. Yeah, you're not going over there.
Exactly, right? So it's this level of, he's ridiculously talented, he has the drive, and he's got the opportunity. Where if he was, say his family stayed in Scotland, he probably would have gone to London at a young age, or to Edinburgh or any of the big other cities at the time, and probably stayed there, never would have made it to Canada. So I think it's a classic case of just someone being born into an opportunity, didn't have all the bells and whistles that maybe somebody would think you need to have, but clearly he had everything he needed from an intellectual perspective. That drive and the opportunities were there. So that's kind of where we leave off with him in his law career, and now he starts to make a move into his political career. So something happens in Canada at that time. We mentioned the Upper Canada Rebellion, and so what the British government did was they looked at Canada and they said, we got to do something here. So Upper Canada rebelled, Lower Canada, which is Quebec, also rebelled. There was a lot of corruption. They weren't happy with the government, so they rejigged the government a little bit and created the province of Canada, which was modern day Quebec and Ontario. And it really set the stage for Sir John A to get into this new level of government, because now there's legislatures being created, there's more opportunities in government, and it's kind of more of a clear track forward into getting to that world. But then tragedy strikes right after the province of Canada is created. His father dies, which is really a major setback in his life. And as we're going to start to see, like, these setbacks really take a toll on him. And we can start to see that the way he kind of handles this is with his drinking, and we'll get into that more in a bit. But this was like the first major setback. So kind of after that, he travels to Britain, where he meets his first wife, and eventually marries her a few years later. But he comes back to Canada and he becomes an alderman of Kingston, which is part of like their municipal council. And then he just starts to move his way up in the government a little bit. He gets elected to the Legislative Assembly. And there's a really interesting story here. So apparently at the time, voting was not a secret ballot. So you kind of just shouted. So they said he won the election by like 250 shouts to like 40. And then on top of that, he just got everybody hammered before. He's like, come on and vote. Here's a bunch of booze for everybody. So everyone just gets hammered and then just votes. And so I don't know what happened to our elections, but I think
this was his move, though, eh? Just getting
yeah.
people wasted. Like, this is like a reoccurring theme in a lot of like historical accounts of Sir John A, of him just getting people trashed to get him on his side.
Like, and just as we can see, as he moves out in his career, like, it definitely bites him in the butt a little bit, but at the same time, like, it may have worked for him. He may just have had this like drunken aura to him that, who knows.
He's a good time guy.
Yeah, for sure, right? So, but again, though, he's gone to this Legislative Assembly, but then again, tragedy strikes again. His first son is born and dies before his second birthday, and then his wife passes away, which really hits him hard here. So there's kind of two schools of thought here where Sir John A is trying to balance. He's seeing this potential future in politics, the ability to build a nation, but he's also got this immense amount of grief that he needs to deal with. And I think, as we can see, he doesn't really take the time to deal with that grief. He doesn't step away from those roles. He doesn't take time to be with other parts of his family. He just kind of dives into this political realm and just keeps going and doubles down. And that's when the drinking really starts to start. He's just known for being drunk a lot, and just when he needs to find kind of get rid of some of that pain, he finds it in the bottom of a bottle. So it's again, like, it's something we're going to continue to see, and it's again that juggling act of career focus moving forward, but also dealing with some really intense grief and feelings. So he moves on, and for about the next 20 years, he holds a variety of political positions within Upper Canada. So he was joint premier a whole bunch of times, in various parts of the government. But this is where some interesting things start to happen. So Canada being built on French-speaking Quebec and English-speaking Ontario, there's always been a bit of a struggle, and there is to this day. So George Brown, who was a colleague of Sir John A.'s at the time, and they definitely butted heads on a lot of things. Sir George Brown wanted to change the government to vote based on population versus a like an electoral system that was taking kind of like we have today with we see in the U.S. with like electoral votes and in districts. But Sir John A. looked at this and said, well, Upper Canada's got more people, so A, they're going to dominate the vote. It's going to alienate the French, and he was thinking so long term that he looked at, okay, well, if I want to get New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, British Columbia to join Canada, we can't have it vote by population because they're going to join and we don't have a voice. And I think this really goes to show the genius of Sir John A. Like, he was not a guy who was thinking like, hey, how can I get that next bill signed? He's thinking like, what is this country going to look like 5, 10, 20 years?
His foresight, right, when it comes to like this nation-making project is quite it's quite unique. Like, I don't think his colleagues were thinking the same way he was in terms of how this was actually going to pan out over the long term.
Yeah, and it's something you see with like CEOs and stuff today. It's like you don't want them dealing with the day to day so much. You want them to think 5, 10 years down the line. And I think he was able to juggle that, but also be like a really great politician and get things done in day to day, week to week, which I think was a really great piece that he had that really not a lot of people had back then. And again, coming from Canada, you weren't getting necessarily the cream of the crop when it came to people all over the world coming to Canada. He was here and he had this really unique set of skills, and again was in a great position to do so. But then 1861 hits, and the American Civil War breaks out. And this is an interesting point for Canada because there's always been some tension between Canada and the U.S. It's only about 50 years after the War of 1812. There's always a worry that, hey, what if they invade again? What if they try to kind of take over? But they're distracted by the Civil War. So what the Canadian government does at the time, of the province of Canada, they're trying to sign a militia bill. Basically, they want to put some troops up around the Canadian border to make sure that there's no funny business going on as the war continues. But the French part of the province of Canada doesn't want to sign this bill. They're like, look, we think the British are going to coerce the Americans into a war, and then we're going to have to get into this. And what are we going to get out of this? Like, nothing. This is just going to be throwing French bodies at a British war, and we're not all about that. So they go to Sir John A. They're like, look, we need some help. The French aren't signing on to this. We need the people in Lower Canada to sign on. And unfortunately, he was too drunk at the time. He was supposed to come help steer the vote. He didn't show up. He was drunk, and the bill failed. And this was kind of one of the first real blemishes on his political career, where he was really leaned on by his party, and he failed because he just really wasn't fit for duty, which is kind of a sad thing that happened here. But as we'll see, this is a balancing act with him, that political career that he has, and dealing with the sorrow and the troubles and the demons that he had.
His trauma, right? Yeah.
So the American Civil War ends, and Canada's now at the point where Confederation and becoming a country is pretty much a formality at this point. But there's a lot of paperwork and stuff that needs to get done. So the first conversations happen in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. So we have New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Ontario get together to discuss building a country. And then later they speak to the people in Quebec. So everybody seems like they're ready to go, but again, Canada is still owned by the British Empire, so they need to sign off on everything, and they're going to be heavily involved in the deal. So the delegates from New Brunswick and Nova Scotia sail to the UK, and again, they're like, hey, Sir John A., we want you there. You're a great speaker. You're a great politician. We need you to help us negotiate this deal and get everything signed. He's supposed to be there on a certain day. He's not showing up. No one really knows what's going on, and they find out that he's been on this bender, and he's been drunk, and he's missed a bunch of times where he's supposed to be at certain places. But he eventually gets there and absolutely crushes it. The delegates from Nova Scotia and New Brunswick are like, yeah, we don't even care that you were late. You did exactly what we needed you to do. We're so thankful for it. And then 1867 happens, and Canada's a country. So we have Quebec, Ontario, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick have all become part of this country. And Sir John A is become Canada's first prime minister. But at this time, something kind of interesting happens with him. He's built this financial empire in York, and which is modern day Toronto, and it takes a really big financial blow. He's been so focused on his political career that his business associate that he really trusted to take on a lot of his finances, he passes away, and the business just kind of goes into the toilet. And he's maybe not a poor man, but he's certainly not a wealthy man like he was before. He was very much an average kind of person financially at that time. And so now it's kind of, he's got this decision, right? Is that nation making, that political will come in? Or does he have to maybe pivot and start thinking about how he can make some money? So I think it's interesting here. We really can see, which I think will come to be pretty important later on, that he's not really motivated by money, like some people would maybe accuse him in the future. He's really focused on, I have a job to do. I want to build this nation, you know. And politics back then was not a place where you were going to go make a lot of money like today. You're not going to be
Yeah.
go to Parliament or go to Congress and then get your $1 million book deal after. Like that didn't exist back then. It was you got a duty to your country, and that's what it was. So he becomes the first prime minister, and he has a heck of a time being prime minister of Canada. So like he has 6 majority governments throughout his time, which is unprecedented even by modern standards, where his party has more seats than all the other parties combined. So
Yep.
he can really control what's going on in the legislature at the time. But Canada really struggled as a country when it first started. They only had 1% GDP growth at the time. Jobs were hard to come by, and a lot of people were actually leaving Canada and going to the U.S. So one of the first things Sir John A does is he acquires Rupert's Land from the British government and the Hudson Bay Company. So Rupert's Land contains, we have the Northwest Territories, a big chunk of northern Quebec and Ontario, big chunk of Manitoba, huge amount of land, like 3.9 million square kilometers for about $1.5 million at the time, which is quite a substantial amount of money. And
Yeah.
I think at the time, like the fur trade was still kind of big, but I think it was starting to get very expensive to just maintain this land and keep it under control because it was purely wilderness at the time. So he brings in that land into Canada, but now some trade wars are starting with the U.S. High tariffs on both sides. They're really concerned about protecting their own businesses. With Canada's slow growth, they're really worried that the U.S. with its bigger population, economics of scale, they're going to be able to sell things a lot cheaper and really ruin Canadian businesses. And at the same time, British Columbia and the Prince Edward Island, they're 2 British colonies that are ready to join a country, but they're not sure who yet. And they're flirting with joining with the U.S. And so Sir John A realizes this, and he goes, okay, these are 2 provinces that need to join Canada. So one of them is he talks to British Columbia, and one thing is they were in really high debt. They wanted connection to the rest of Canada. And this is where Sir John A gets a little bit of criticism, whereas he went to negotiate with the government of British Columbia, and basically said, "Hey, we'll help you out with our debt. We'll do all these for you." And the conversations after, the British Columbian government came back and was like, "Oh my God, like they're giving us everything we wanted and more." So it was like, where do we sign, right? They were so happy for it. So this really comes into Sir John A's national policy. So it was really 3 things. It was high tariffs, like we talked about, to really protect the businesses from the United States and Europe. Settling the West, basically west of Ontario, was either unclaimed land, some of the Rupert's Land that they purchased, and then other provinces that really hadn't made an allegiance to a country yet. And then I think the final thing here, which is kind of the theme of the day, is a railway. So connecting all of Canada and really bringing that national policy together by allowing that economic growth to spread, not just from the main provinces in Ontario and Quebec, but to the entire nation. So, Richie, I think this is where we start to look at this railway, and we think, hey, let's build a railway. Sounds simple, right? I think there's a little bit more than that, right? There's a little bit more going on behind the scenes than just building a railway.
Well, I think you nailed it, right? Like I think there's a couple things to keep in mind here before we kind of segue into the scandal, which is, one, it's absolutely amazing to think of like Sir John A as the founding father of Canada, while trying to juxtapose that as this guy who is, a bit of a drunkard,
Yeah.
who's literally come from nothing, and has been able to have substantial amount of success, in business and politics. So, and on your last couple of points around, BC flirting with, joining the U.S., you have high tariffs, selling the West and the railway, and this is the perfect segue to, the first major political scandal in Canada, which is, the Pacific Scandal, and it happened in between the years of 1872 and 1873. So this is the first post-Federation Canadian scandal. So we'll see how it measures up across, the timelines of great Canadian scandals, but this was the first one. So essentially, Sir John A and the senior members of his Conservative cabinet were accused of accepting election funds from shipping magnate Sir Hugh Allan, who was based out of Montreal, in exchange for the contract to build the Canadian Pacific Railway. So it's important to note that at this point in Canada's history, most financial activities of political parties are unregulated. So it kind of lends itself to having this environment where, periodic scandals are kind of a sign of the times. And the scandal is quite unique as well, I think, based on, Paul, what you were saying around the idea of kind of settling the West, railways, confederation, nation making. You have the scandal, which is kind of the epicenter of this convergence of many different but varyingly important historical topics and themes, right? We have railways, confederation, industrialization, nation making, and we're on the cusp of like the Gilded Age, right? We have names that are going to start cropping up throughout the history books: the Carnegies, the Rockefellers. This is an era of massive expansion and building. And railways, are a unique nation-making project. And although they are a unique nation-making project, there has been a lot of research done on the amount of corruption that was kind of imbued and tangled with this kind of railway projects that were happening not only in Canada but in the U.S. as well as, in Europe as well. I actually came across a National Post article that was entitled, "quote unquote, railroad building in the 19th century was an orgy of corruption, but hey, it built a country." And I think the author nails it. Like, honestly, we're talking about massive public building projects with kickbacks to private entities, making massive fortunes off public debt, because this wasn't really financially motivated. Like, these were political bargaining tools at the end of the day. Hey, we'll build you a railroad, join Canada.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's not, the end kind of justifies the means. And I think this is a conversation we'll touch on back later in the episode. But it's also happening at the tail end of what's considered, as railway mania. So it's this speculative bubble of railroad building expansion that happened in the UK and other parts of Europe, but eventually made its way westwards to the US and to Canada. And then you take this other layer and you kind of layer it on top. You have railways and corruption, you have railway mania, and then you have railways and confederation. And as someone who studied history and took many Canadian history courses, you can't talk about confederation without talking about railways. Like,
Right.
it just can't happen. And then if we kind of circle back to that flirtation that BC is having at the time with wanting to join a country in 1871, Sir John A pretty much promises British Columbia, gives them a blank check, carte blanche. Hey, we'll give you everything you want, as long as you join the Dominion of Canada. And this included a transcontinental railway, the Canadian Pacific Railway, the CPR for short, that it would be built within 10 years and would be 1,600 kilometers longer than the first American transcontinental. So if we just kind of think about that lift, which it's huge, that is a huge lift. Considering that Canada at this point in time is only a nation of about 3 million people, and our neighbors to the south, just to have some perspective, have a population that's just about to touch 40 million. So this is a massive, massive lift for us. So this is kind of, the scandal in a nutshell. And then if we kind of look at the nuances of the scandal, I think there's like kind of two phases to it, right? There's the actual campaign donation, which happened behind the scenes that people were not privy to. And then there's the actual unearthing of the scandal, that shines light on, these kind of nefarious transactions between these highly influential businessmen and the Conservative Party of Canada. So clearly the scope of what was promised to British Columbia was quite large. And there's no doubt that building transcontinental railways is a massive capital project and is very capital intensive and requires serious funding and monetary availability. So what they were actually promising required a lot of capital funds, but to ensure that they could provide those funds for that project, they would need to shore up their majority in the upcoming general election in 1872. To do that, they actually reached out. It was Sir John A and a few of his more enterprising cabinet members, Sir George Etienne Cartier and Hector Louis Langevin, who went to look for funds for the 1870 general election. Their target was Sir Hugh Allen. He was a Montreal shipping magnate and railway builder. So the Conservatives needed money in a bad way, and Sir Hugh Allen, being the businessman that he was, saw an opportunity where he was essentially given the rights to build the CPR in exchange for a $350,000 campaign donation. That would be $7.5 million in today's money. Like, that is huge, dude.
Yeah.
Huge. That's big money.
But I think he's thinking long term, right? Like 7.5 million for a 1,600-kilometer railway. That's a drop in the bucket, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that'll pay over, lifetimes over for him. So ironically, the Conservatives actually fared quite poorly in that general election. They were able to remain in power, but their majority was greatly diminished. But they were able to lock it in. So after the election, the railway syndicate under Allen's leadership, they were awarded the contract under the assumption that he would actually remove American control of the syndicate's board of directors. He wasn't actually able to do that, given the reality that $350,000 campaign donation had actually included U.S. monetary funds. So he was entangled with U.S. business interests.
Which is kind of crazy when the whole point of the bribe, essentially, for lack of a better term, was, okay, well, do this, but keep the Americans out of it. When he's kind of backdoor, has the Americans involved, and he's kind of playing like three-level chess.
This guy's playing, he's playing 4D chess, right? And he looks like he's going to come out on top, essentially. And I think it might be important to kind of just talk about that. As I was reading this, it might not be obvious to listeners as to why, we live in such a collaborative world, right? Where there's bilateral multinational agreements with countries. But at this point in time in history, the isolationist inwards approach of protecting Canadian business and Canadian interests is at the forefront of most decision-making processes. So, from a political perspective, a railway building perspective, we don't need American influence or interests, being pervasive in our kind of decision-making process. So there is that implication there, I think, that people should be, familiar with. So, shortly after, being awarded the contract, the, quote unquote nefarious dealings between, Allen and the Conservatives come to light. So Allen is actually a prolific letter writer and note taker. He keeps great records, much to his detriment. It happens. Between his correspondence between him, Sir John A, and George Cartier, essentially outlining the agreement between the two parties to exchange campaign donation for rights to build the CPR. How these letters come to light is actually quite interesting. So Allen's lawyer, John Abbott's secretary, George Norris, and an unknown accomplice, I couldn't find the accomplice's name, had actually stolen letters that Allen had given his lawyer for safekeeping. Norris sold the letters to the Liberal opposition for $5,000. And the story broke on April 2nd, 1873, and the contract was tossed out and construction on the CPR was halted. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah,
right?
It's crazy, right? Because first off, you give it to your lawyer, you're thinking criminally I'm good here because this is my lawyer, there's all that confidentiality and stuff, and you can't use those things in court, but still it could leak, right? And then it gets sold, and it's kind of a wild thing. There was no real TMZ back then where you could sell something to, but again, there's newspapers out there, and it's
exactly print journalism, right?
Yeah, exactly, right. Scandals sell. So, wow, it's insane to just think just again keeping great notes because hey, I got to be organized, and then whoops, they got into the wrong hands, and now they have all this incriminating evidence. It's just smoking gun after smoking gun after smoking gun.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Well, it's a perfect point, right? Like scandals are always fun and interesting and engaging, and they really tug at people's, ethical and like, moral kind of strings as people. Everyone's always talking about them, but like, what are the key implications here for us, right? And from a perspective of like what this scandal meant to Canadians at the time. Um, so obviously the Conservatives are forced to resign at this moment because Sir John A is pretty much screwed, right? Like like you said, there
Yep.
is the smoking gun. He's on record asking for money in a telegram from Alan's lawyer, and I know you and I have kind of read this a couple times, off screen, and it's quite hilarious. But this is a direct quote. I must have another 10,000. Will be the last time of calling. Do not fail me. Answer today. Like if that doesn't, it's so
It's like
good. It's so
it's
good.
just better every time you say it. It's like
Yeah,
a
it just
mafia
gets
boss
sweeter.
saying like,
It's
"Where's
so
my
funny.
money? I'm gonna break your legs. You better give it to me tomorrow." But like for the leader of a country to be saying that again, like we talked about a smoking gun. That's like a bomb went off in the middle of the city, and you just oh yeah, there it is. There's the evidence you need. It's absolutely insane that
Yeah.
someone would write that down something like that. But I guess hey, it was a different time, right? Like it's still a new technology, and
What's
oh
also
yeah, it's
interesting, he says
secure and stuff.
answer today, right? Like he's like answer today. I'm like, well,
Yeah,
that's interesting that he would expect an answer on the same day. Like
yeah,
it seems like we're far removed historically speaking from like
mhm,
instant messaging, but clearly
yeah.
via the telegram, he could have received correspondence within,
Hmm.
the same day. On that note, so that's like the one smoking gun that I think is
Right.
quite funny and ironic to point out. But there were many other telegrams that were kind of distributed as a part of this release that was sold to the Liberal Party. And along with the telegrams there were also, sorry, telegrams found between Allen and his American financiers, essentially communicating that he was promised the position of president of the CPR in exchange for quote unquote certain monetary conditions. So just take that in for a second, right? Like
Yeah.
if that doesn't like spell it out for us, I don't know what else will.
I
Like
like picked
it's
a guy
right
with
there.
like a big top hat wearing like smoking a pipe being just saying that because like it just sounds like someone who knows they're being
He has a
nefarious.
monocle, yeah, like
Yeah,
yeah, you know what I
exactly.
mean?
Just like
Yeah,
the
pocket, nice little pocket watch.
the Monopoly man, just like yeah, it's a different just a different type of world too, where it's this super elite, ultra rich, but also like kind of just not connected in the same way we see today. So it's almost like everything that's kind of done almost seems like it's like a backroom deal, and it probably was, right? That's probably where the term probably starts from, where
Yeah.
you don't have all of this like, yeah, I picked up the phone and called them. It's we had a meeting at our country club while we were drinking whiskey or something like that's what I always think with these kind of guys.
It's what it sounds like, right? Like, and I think
Yeah.
that's something we'll touch on, which is like how similar and how close to present day does this sound to us, outside of the language and the use of a telegram. I think there's a lot of similarities here that, would still hold true today. But like if we go
Hmm.
back to the aftermath of it, so, Sir John A, the Conservatives are screwed. They essentially they were removed from office, but MacDonald, being the charismatic, successful leader that he is able to actually retain leadership of his party, although they step down, from government as being those in power. So at this point in time, there's obviously implications on the railway. So the CPR wouldn't begin for a few more years as railway construction, although still progressing, slowed down substantially under the Mackenzie Liberal government, largely because of lack of public funding. Um, and then once MacDonald comes back, subsequently after the Mackenzie Liberal government, he would come back in 1878 with a much more, aggressive construction and taxation policy, Paul, that you were mentioning, that would oversee the completion of the CPR. In addition to this much more aggressive approach to building and finalizing uh, the railway building projects, there is also a new Montreal-based syndicate that signs a contract with Sir John A to help build the CPR for $25 million and a 25 million acre land grant. This syndicate included Bank of Montreal president George Stevens, Ontario-born Minnesota entrepreneur James J. Hill, U.S. rail financier Duncan McIntyre, Richard B. Angus, and John Stewart Kennedy. I was trying to do a little bit more research around who these guys were and what this essentially meant for them, but for people to understand like what they were awarded is quite. nuts in today's terms. So we're really talking about like these guys won the lottery when it came to the contract they were awarded for the CPR. They were given the modern day equivalent of like $1 billion of cash and infrastructure and a land grant the size of Ireland and pretty much assured a 20-year monopoly.
Wow. And the thing too is like this is the railway in Canada.
This
You
is
want to
the
ship
railway.
anything
Yeah,
coast to coast, it's
this is it.
going through these guys, and that's it. Like no other options. Like what are you gonna do? Sure, you can take it by horseback and you'll get there in 6 months, or you can take the railway. Like it's a
What are you
monopoly,
supposed
and
to
a lot
do?
of
Yeah,
yeah,
you
and
can't like you're kind of screwed if you don't. You're screwed if you do, right? Like,
yeah,
and he's got to get it done. So we kind of have this syndicate working. They've been awarded very handsomely this really great contract. And then eventually, if we're talking about the CPR specifically, so the first transcontinental passenger train departed from Montreal at 8 p.m. on June 28th, 1886, and arrived at Port Moody at noon on the 4th of July, 1886. The train consisted of two baggage cars, a mail car, one second class coach, two immigrant sleepers, two first class coaches, two sleeping cars, and a diner. So all in all, obviously, we were able to eventually have the CPR, fully functioning, to actually send people across, connect British Columbia to the rest of Canada. And it's clear to see that the controversy that railway projects were embroiled in, given the political and historical atmosphere that they were being built in. But I think there's a quote that really just kind of hits it home for me. It's from Canadian historian George Stanley. It's a quote from the Canadians, which is this kind of like seminal historical work, and it reads, "Bonds of steel as well as of sentiment were needed to hold the new confederation together. Without railways, there would be and could be no Canada." And I
wow,
think like that quote to me really brings it home in terms of what Sir John A was trying to do. The scandal, in my perspective, was a means to an end to be able to accomplish that greater nation making goal. Um, was it appropriate? I'm sure we can have a discussion on that, but this kind of, just to kind of come full circle around, the why behind the railway, the importance of confederation and what the railway represented, and how some of those decisions were possibly made with the grander goal in mind of creating
mhm.
a connected Canada from coast to coast.
Yeah, that really hits deep, kind of that quote, and just like how without that connectivity, the nation wouldn't exist. And one thing I thought of was, you ever kind of see like those old kind of Western movies where it's like, yeah, this used to be a booming town until the railway skipped past our town and now it's a ghost town, right? Like if you think of the time, like finding the Northwest Passage through the Arctic was this crazy thing that everybody was trying to do. Like if we can get ships from the Atlantic into the Pacific
Yep.
over the north of Canada, we've found this new shipping lane, and commerce is going to go through the roof, because otherwise at the time you're going all the way around South America to get there, or going even the other way. But now Sir John A is looking at this, right, and he sees, okay, well, the US is going to build a railway, so you can stop off in New York City, you can ship things to LA, and another ship can pick it up and bring it over to Asia and India and different countries like that. And so Canada could have been that old dusty town that, hey, we were a thriving country until the US built that railway and, kind of bypassed us, and all of that economic opportunity coming from, which was, I guess, at the time, which was super wealthy and where a lot of money was coming from. And if this didn't happen, like Canada wouldn't have been able to survive economically. And the likes of British Columbia and the likes of Prince Edward Island would have been looking at that being like, well, the US is looking a little bit more attractive today. So I really think that quote really hits home on the railway in Canada. One doesn't exist without the other.
And I think like even if we take it outside of Canada, right? Like I know we've touched on it a couple of times from your perspective and my perspective, but this idea of like railway mania,
Hmm.
like it started in the 1830s in the UK. Again, it's like this speculative boom of how much money could potentially be made off the expansion of railway tracks across the UK. So you have this massive project happening in the UK, you have it happening in the US, now you have it happening in Canada as well. But there are railways like being created in China at the same time.
Hmm.
Like the 19th century is really the century of modern nation making. And as a part of that modern nation making project, you know, when you talk about Canada, you talk about railways. That's it. It is what it is, and I
Mhm.
think you lose. I think we lose sight of how important railways were more globally speaking as well, and what they represented, particularly in this century when it came to that kind of nation-making project.
Right. And I think too, it's like you kind of think of like a whole supply chain kind of connection. Like you even look at like a lot of the major cities built on a river and they're built on the sea or built
Yep.
on a lake. And if you didn't have that, really, how are you going to get any sort of economic opportunity? And I think the railway, it unlocks this nation to be a lot larger. Because I think even, back in the day, it would be you'd have like really rich city states and small sections and kingdoms and stuff that were kind of along the coast. But then within the center of the country, it'd be more wilderness and more kind of individual little kingdoms that would spring up. But like think of China, for example, a huge country, only one coast. All those
Yep.
areas in the middle now have connection to the railway. They can get goods to Shanghai in two
Yep.
days and ship them to the US or ship them to Europe, where that wouldn't have existed. And for what purpose would someone in the center of China have with the people on the east if they don't have that economic opportunity? So, yeah, I think it's a great point because you just really don't. We're thinking of it in the eyes of Canada here, but like this is something every country is going through, and without
Well,
it,
yeah, and I think from like a
the
history
nations wouldn't exist
perspective,
like they
right?
would today, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think from a historical perspective, just like this idea of like big history. I know what we're taught in school, and I think the reason why we're doing this is because we think there's a serious gap. That's how
Yeah.
that's a nice way of putting it. In terms of how like Canadian history and history in general is kind of taught, in the younger grades, and you don't really get the full picture and understand like the implication of a lot of things we're learning because we learn things in a vacuum. So it's like, okay, cool, railways, Canada, beaver hats, fur trade, HBC, right? You kind of just sum it up there, but I think it makes it much more real for people to understand that although it happened in Canada and it was super important for the history of our country, it also happened in other theaters as well across the globe, and it really just is indicative of the similarities that a lot of countries were going through at the same time.
hmm And to maybe even look at like a modern sense too, I think of like high-speed internet, for example, right? Like I I don't have like any data to prove this, but I'm pretty sure if you looked at areas that had high-speed internet compared to areas that don't, and the economic opportunities that they have, I'm pretty sure it's going to skew highly to the sides that have the connectivity. And we can even start to see Canada now being like, hey, we need to make sure that no matter where you live in this country, you need to have connection to high-speed internet. Same in the United States, and a lot of other countries are starting to do this now. And I think it's like kind of almost like maybe not to the level of a modern day railway, but like kind of in the same vein, right? Like if we can get people who are in Northern Ontario who maybe have been limited to, subsistence farming and maybe just kind of having small businesses in their area can now work for a multinational corporation, but still live in a remote community and really bring kind of that economic development to those areas and potentially kind of bring countries, closer together than they were and really get rid of some of that separation. I don't think it has the level of what the railway did because we're not worrying about certain areas separating or joining other countries, but just bringing that economic opportunity across an entire nation, I think is maybe an interesting modern equivalent.
So I think I'm really digging back into the archives of my history learnings, but I believe in Canada, the Railways Act was actually supplemented by the Telecommunications Act.
Ah,
So your
interesting.
analogy is quite apt in terms of how we kind of transitioned from the railway being like the central line of communication across provinces
hmm
or across countries, and how communi- you know these more higher level abstracted communication channels kind of supplanted what we initially saw the railway as. I have to check that, but I'm 80% confident that
hmm
that actually did happen from like a historical legal perspective in Canada.
I think you're right because even if you go along like any of the railways in Canada, you can see still like some of the old kind of connectivity of like looks like old kind of phone lines going alongside.
Yes.
I don't
Yep.
think they're in use anymore, but yeah, that would make sense, right? Like you have that land cleared out, it's being maintained all the time. Putting something with telecommunications on the side would make sense. So yeah, I could see that, but I kind of want to pivot to just more about the scandal itself. And like I've been trying to think like Sir John A really need to do this, and I'm really struggling to justify this because like as you said here, like these guys from the Bank of Montreal and all these entrepreneurs and big industrialists, like they won one of the lotteries maybe ever.
Oh
So
yeah.
this is something that everybody wanted to do, and maybe there was a level of uncertainty there that maybe isn't coming to light that I'm not seeing here. But like, did he really need that, or was it just like we need to stay in power by all means necessary, and if we don't get this cash, we might not be able to do it, and then we won't be able to kind of lead this charge. But I'm really struggling with it, and I don't really know the answer.
Yeah, I think that's the catch-22, right? Like I don't think in terms of finding financiers and, you know, interested parties to support the building of a railway in Canada at this point in time is going to be too difficult
Yeah,
of an ask, right? I think it really came down to, and obviously, like this is conjecture. I can't tell you what Sir John A was thinking. I didn't know. I'm not Sir John A, but I just look at our, and I think this is kind of tangential to one of the questions I wanted to bring up is like, how does this kind of measure up against other Canadian political scandals? Which
right.
is, um, this guy's the leader of a country. You know, he has the goal of uniting Canada from coast to coast. I think when you're trying to do something that grand, right? I can't even imagine trying to do something that big.
Hmm.
Um, there's a likelihood that you're going to be like super laser and singularly focused on your goal.
Right.
That everything might just become a means to an end at that point.
Mm.
That that campaign donation was more about, we just need to secure power, we need to maintain our majority, and we need to make sure that we're the ones who are pushing this thing across the finish line at the end of the day,
Hmm.
to shore up those seats, to shore up our campaign funding so that we can beat the Liberals in the next election and keep going on this journey of unifying Canada. And like that to me is why I think they took the donation.
Hmm.
It didn't end up helping much, ironically. Like they
Yeah.
won. They won and held on to a majority, although their majority was like greatly depleted. Like was the juice worth the squeeze? Like it's hard to I can
Yeah.
understand why he did it, but I don't necessarily think it was the right move because it
Hmm.
didn't. I don't think it played out in a way that they had anticipated.
For sure. And I think when we kind of talk in this podcast, right, we like to look at leaders. We like to look at why they made decisions. And if we look at this decision on its outcome, hey, I would do it 10 times out of 10, right? Like you got the railway built, you built the nation, it worked. But I think you always have to judge these decisions on what what was kind of the decision making at the time, and regardless of what the output was, because you don't know if this was going to work or not. And I kind of agree that like it, unless like even if the party was in the so in debt and like where maybe they were on the brink of collapse, like who knows what was going on behind the scenes. It's you can't justify because you are supposed to be the leader of a nation, you are supposed to have the people's interests at heart, and I
Yeah,
can't
yeah.
justify it from like an ethical perspective. And I get it why they did it. And maybe this stuff goes on more than we realize. And I think you kind of
Oh yeah.
mentioned like some modern scandals, right? Like we see some of the scandals like the SNC Lavalin one,
Oh
for
yeah.
example, in Canada, right? Like, Justin Trudeau didn't come out and say, I need to build a nation. I need to connect Canada. And the stakes are so high because we have to think too, like this is Sir John A. time. This is pre-World War One. This is pre-World War Two. Like the world is still teetering on the brink of destroying itself and nations being ripped up and maps redrawn. Where today, you know, there's some areas in the world where we're seeing this, but nowhere near the scale that it was back then. So, yeah, I think when we look at modern day, like if this happened in the modern day, you'd be like, yeah, there's no need to do something like that. Versus back then when the stakes were so much higher and the level of
Yeah, I think
uncertainty
I
was so
think
different.
that's it though, right? Like I think
Yeah.
that is the thing we need to think about. Like if we're talking about Sir John A making a decision to take campaign donations, right? Does the end justify his means? And I think it's easy for us to, like place today's social and ethical mores on that of the past, and I don't recommend that. I think that's a messy game,
Right.
as we can see in other examples. But in this particular context, like you have the United States to the south of us, right? That is going through a massive westerly expansion, right after they're in the Reconstruction period, right after the Civil War. So they are rebuilding a nation. You have the same thing going on in the UK. You have these, provinces that are like geographically linked to Canada, but are flirting with the idea of joining another country. I couldn't even imagine what that would feel like. Hey, here's a province, and he's like two timing me. Like he's
Yeah,
talking to some next
right.
country, trying to hook up with them, and I'm trying to court this province, but like at the same time they're keeping their options open. Like it's 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 very hard, I think, to understand all those dynamics and different variables at play. But if the goal, and I think again, projecting backwards, it seems like his goal was, very laser focused on unifying Canada.
Hmm.
And if that was his kind of framework for his decision making, then everything he does makes sense,
Right.
right? Because that's his ultimate goal. And if the ends justify the means, and the ends is creating a unified country, mission accomplished. I think, he did have a hiccup along the way because the campaign donation probably ended up slowing things down by a couple years,
That's
right?
true. Yeah.
Ironically, but he was still able to hold on to his leadership of the party
Hmm.
and come back for what, four more majority governments, five more
Yeah.
after
5
that.
more. Yeah.
Yeah, so like, did it even tarnish him? Like outside of that, like
Yeah.
3-4 year hiccup, like it's like, oh, whatever, we'll just keep
Yeah.
going.
I think it just shows too, like at the end of the day, you're a politician, you represent the people, and the people wanted him back, right? They said, hey, look, like we need this railway built, we need our economy to grow, and he eventually delivered. And so, yeah, sure, was it the right decision? Probably not, but it maybe just needed to be done. And again, I kind of respect the fact that he had a plan and he was like, this is what we're doing. I'm not going to fiddle around. I'm not going to flip flop. I'm like, these are things that need to be done. Like even the talk of like BC joining the US. Like, could you imagine Canada just not having really much access to the Pacific coast unless you count like
Well,
Yukon way up in the north, right? It's
exactly, right? Like think
impossible. Like, how could you all that commerce going, especially in modern day, right? Like going to China that comes through Vancouver every day
yeah, yeah, yeah.
would have to be
Like
going through another country, and especially back then, not a country that you were. Canada and the U.S. are very friendly today, but back then was not the case.
yeah.
Again, like you said, we were saying, you're still 50 years out from a war where the United States tried to invade Canada. Like it's
That's such a
crazy.
good point. That's such a good point, right? And I think this might even, like, again, more conjecture, more projection, but operating under the pretense and the foresight that we can clearly see Sir John A operating under, he probably sees that. Like if British Columbia is a part of the US, like we've essentially cut off a major valve of future trading
Right.
opportunities into
And
the
with China too, right? Like you've been talking, like, hey, China's building a railway. Their economy is going to grow. They're going to be building stuff. Japan's doing the same thing. India's a massive trading partner
yeah.
as well in the world at the time. Like have access to this one of the major oceans in the world, and we're supposed to be from sea to sea. This could be the end of the country, right? Like the U.S. could be like, sorry, everything comes through us now. We're going to hit you with high tariffs. It's
That's a good point, man. Because
yeah,
I think it's like there's a certain duality there, right? It's like, well, we need to create a railway system that connects all of the provinces together to have this unified kind of Canadian identity. And I think most of us will probably stop there with our
mhm,
analysis. But if you look at it, one level of abstraction higher, I think that point of like, okay, well, what does that actually mean? Well, that means British Columbia is a part of Canada, and now we have access to the entire westerly coast of Canada and the opportunities that represents for future commerce and trade, right? Like that.
mhm.
I don't know what the numbers are, but I would imagine that they're, quite significant over the
Yeah,
history of Canada being a country. So yeah, I think that's a really good point that you don't often hear about.
for sure. Yeah, it's almost your mind kind of blows up when you really try to think about like what would be the impact of that. And again, Sir John A. saw it. He knew
Yeah.
what needed to be done, and he got it done. And I think that goes to his legacy, which I think is a conversation for another day. But I think that's a good place to kind of stop and kind of we can reflect a little bit on Sir John A. And maybe pick this up in another conversation. Hey, he did all of this great stuff with the railway, but again, he's only into majority 2 or 3 here of
Yeah,
6. So I think
it's
there's a
quite early in the
yeah,
process of the
he's still
timeline. Sorry.
early in the game. He definitely got a lot done early on, but there's still a little bit more to go, which I think is a conversation for next time. So, Richie, this has been good. I think we can wrap this one up as a good first episode and see everybody next week.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it. Thank you so much for listening to the History in Motion podcast. We appreciate your support, and if you're a fan of what you heard, please like, subscribe, and share. And we'll see you next time.